Noam Chomsky 教授は1928年
The oldest of two boys, Abraham Noam Chomsky, was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1928. As a Jewish child, the anti-Semitism of the time affected him. Both parents taught Hebrew, and he became fascinated by literature, reading translations of French and Russian classics. He also took an interest in a grammar book written by his father on Hebrew of the Middle Ages. He recalls a childhood absorbed in reading, curled up in a sofa, often borrowing up to 12 books at once from the library. He is married to Carol, and they have 3 children.
I don't like to impose on my wife and children a form of life that they certainly haven't selected for themselves, namely one of public exposure or exposure to the public media. That's their choice, and I don't believe that they have themselves selected this. I don't impose it on them. I would like to protect them from it, frankly. Second, sort of perhaps principal point is that I'm rather against the idea, the whole notion of developing public personalities who are treated as stars of one kind or another, where aspects of their personal life are supposed to have some significance and so on.
Take 1 in the reception room.
You said that you were just like us. You went to school, got good grades, and what made you start being critical, you know, and seeing the different? What started the change? You know what I mean?
Well, you know, there are all kinds of personal factors in anybody's life. I mean, first of all, don't forget I grew up in a depression. My parents actually happened to have jobs, which was kind of unusual. They were Hebrew school teachers, so sort of lower middle class. For them, everything revolved around being Jewish, Hebrew and Palestine in those days and so on. And I grew up in that milieu. So, you know, I learned Hebrew and went to Hebrew school, became a Hebrew school teacher, went to Hebrew college, led youth groups, summer camps, Hebrew camps, the whole business. The branch of the Zionist movement that I was part of was all involved in socialist binationalism and Arab-Jewish cooperation and all sorts of nice stuff.
What did they think of your hopping on a train and going up to New York and hanging out at anarchist bookstores on 4th Avenue and talking to
they didn't mind
your
because
working class relatives there?
I mean, I don't want to totally trust my childhood memories, obviously, but the family was split up. Like a lot of Jewish families, it went in all sorts of directions. There were sectors that were super orthodox. There were other sectors that were very radical and very assimilated and working class intellectuals. You know. And that's the sector that I naturally gravitated towards. It was a very lively intellectual culture. For one thing, it was a working class culture, had working class values, values of solidarity, socialist values, and so on. There was a sense somehow things were going to get better. And an institutional structure was around, the method of fighting, you know, of organizing, of doing things, which had some hope. And I also had the advantage of having gone to a experimental progressive school, to a Dewey school, which was quite good, run by a university there. And, you know, there was no such thing as competition. There was no such thing as being a good student. I mean, literally, the concept of being a good student didn't even arise until I got to high school. I went to the academic high school and suddenly discovered I'm a good student, you know, then I hated high school because I had to do all the things you have to do to get into college. But until then, it was kind of a free, pretty open system. And I don't know, there were lots of other things. Well, maybe I was just cantankerous.
As a historian, I have read with interest and amazement your long review article of Gabriel Jackson's Spanish Civil War, and that's a very respectable piece of history, and I can appreciate how much work goes into that.
You know when I did that work?
When did you do that?
I did that work in the early 1940s when I was about 12 years old. The first article I wrote was right after the fall of Barcelona in the school newspaper. It was a lament about the rise of fascism in 1939.
Actually, I guess one of the people who was the biggest influence in my life was an uncle who had never gone past 4th grade. He was, had a background in crime, and then left-wing politics and all sorts of things. But he was a hunchback, and as a result, he could get a newsstand in New York. So they had some program for people with physical disabilities. And some of you are from New York, I guess. Well, you know the 72nd Street kiosk? You know that? Right, that's where I got my political education. At 72nd Street, there's a place where you come out of the subway, and everybody goes towards 72nd Street. And there were 2 newsstands on that side, which were doing fine, and there's 2 newsstands on the back. And nobody comes out the back, and that's where his newsstand. But it was a very lively place. He was a very bright guy. It was the 30s. There were a lot of emigres, so on. A lot of people were hanging around there. And in the evenings, especially, it was sort of a literary political salon. Every kind of guy is hanging around, arguing and talking. And as a kid, like I was 11, 12 years old, the biggest excitement was to work the newsstand.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control of our resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When we talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
To start with, there are 2 different groups. We can get into more detail. But at the first level of approximation, there's 2 targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population, which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. One group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right. Professor Chomsky, Noam, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. It's a soundbite that says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours.
Really knows all the times.
Got a minute for all the time, so that's.
I love this soundbite.
Okay, well.
And they do this in all sorts of ways. By selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues. by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
This is democracy's diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives, the place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer.
The process by which people make up their minds on this is a much more mysterious process than you would ever guess from reading Manufacturing Consent. There is a saying about legislation that legislation is like making sausage, that the less you know about how it's done, the better for your appetite. The same is true of this business. If you're in a conference in which decisions are being made on what to put on page 1 or whatnot, you would get, I think, the impression that important decisions were being made in a flippant and frivolous way. But in fact, given the pressures of time to trying to get things out, you resort to a kind of a shorthand. And you have to fill that paper up every day. It's curious in a kind of a mirror image way that Professor Chomsky is in total accord with Reed Irvine, who at the right-wing end of the spectrum says exactly what Chomsky does about the insinuating influence of the press, of the big media, as, quote, agenda setters, to use one of the great buzzwords of the time. And, of course, Reed Irvine sees this as a left-wing conspiracy of foisting liberal ideas in both domestic and foreign affairs on the American people. But in both cases, I think that the premise really is an insult to the intelligence of the people who consume it.